Welcome to the special series on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Tennessee World Affairs Council President Pat Ryan. We're pleased you've joined us today. Earlier this year, we presented a series of virtual conversations on the invasion of Ukraine featuring Ambassador John Kornblum, who joins us today. We're continuing those conversations alongside our partner, the American Council on Germany. I'd like to thank Dr. Steve Sokol at this council for all they bring to these global awareness programs. Their work to strengthen German-American relations is an important contribution to knowing the world. We're also joined by sister World Affairs Councils in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Kansas City, Missouri, and Peoria, Illinois. We welcome their members and members of World Affairs Councils from around the country who are with us today as well. Let me mention that Dr. Joyce Davis at WAC Harrisburg has already hosted a session on Ukraine that we were pleased to be part of. She talked about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine with aid officer Tamara Demoria. That program is available on the WAC Harrisburg Facebook page, and we will include it in our series archive as well. We're also thankful for the commitment of our regular partners for this series and all that they do to help TNWAC, the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, the Center for International Business at Belmont University, and the University of Tennessee Center for Global Engagement. This series will continue on July 21st with a program featuring former Ukrainian Minister of Education and Science, Anna Novosad, and the perspective from Ukraine. On August 18th, with distinguished historian, Professor Thomas Schwartz from Vanderbilt University, talking about the old and new Cold Wars. And then on the 25th of August, Ambassador Kornblum returns to wind up the series along with Dr. Marietta Velikova, Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for International Business at Belmont. They'll talk about the domestic situation in Russia and US-Russia relations. You can register for those programs now at tnwac.org. We're also pleased to announce one of our fall programs in the Distinguished Visiting Speaker Program. TNWAC will host Admiral Michael Rogers, retired US Navy 4-star, on November 7th and 8th. Admiral Rogers is the most recent Director of the National Security Agency, Commander, United States Cyber Command, and Chief U.S. Central Security Service. We will offer a town hall on November 7th, so mark your calendars for that. We invite businesses and other organizations to contact TNWAC for hosting and sponsorship opportunities for Admiral Rogers' visit. The last piece of housekeeping. This World Affairs Council is a public service organized by volunteers and made possible by your financial support. Please become a member and make a donation. The Council is in the midst of a transition from a founder-led volunteer organization to a more sustainable model. Your financial support is key to that transition and the continuation and availability of these high-quality speaker programs and our education outreach to youth. You can visit tnwac.org to find out how you can become a member or where you can make a donation. Thank you. Now, on to our special guest. Ambassador John C. Kornblum has a long record of service in the United States and Europe, both as a diplomat and as a businessman. He is recognized as an eminent expert on US-European political and economic relations, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. He served as the US ambassador to Germany from 1997 to 2001. Before that, he occupied a number of high-level diplomatic posts, including US Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Special Envoy for the Dayton Peace Process, US Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Helsinki Process, Deputy US Ambassador to NATO, and US Minister and Deputy Commandant of Forces in divided Berlin. You can find in our archives the previous conversations that started back in February and ran through April with Ambassador Kornblum. We look forward to your participation in the conversation. You can start adding your questions to the Q&A queue on your Zoom screen, and we will get to them right after our conversation. Ambassador Kornblum, thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. I hear you. I'm very happy to be here.
Can you set the scene for how we got to where we are in the summer of 2022, 133 days since Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine? What is your view from the 4 points of Ukraine, Europe, the US, and Russia?
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you very much for the invitation. As you were going back over the series of discussions you've had, you can see that it started out in my case, when I was still in Berlin, and I will be going back to Berlin in the fall, but it also started out with a lot of questions about what was going on and why was this important to us. In the meantime, I think we have a pretty good idea of what is going on, unfortunately. And I hope that there's a better understanding now about what this all means to us. I think there is. But I thought I would start with that part of your question to say, what does this mean for us? Ukraine is Europe's largest country, according to landmass. It's second only to Russia, actually, which is a Eurasian country. But as a pure European country, Ukraine is the largest. It has 45 or so million people, which puts it up there in the top 10 for sure of countries in Europe. But it is a country which has never really had a clear international identity, mostly because it has been part of the Russian Empire since the early 18th century. And there have, however, been resurgent efforts at independence in the 19th century, the latest in the early 1920s, and now the one which is successful, and I'm quite sure will remain successful, starting in 1992. For Russia, and here is, I think, the place where this affects America more than the important political and humanitarian aspects which you're going to be discussing in other sessions. It is important to the United States for two reasons. One, because it has followed a trend which has not been stimulated by the West, of countries which were on the periphery of Russia in the Soviet Union. That is the Baltic states, that's Ukraine, that's Azerbaijan, that's Armenia, that's Uzbekistan. All of these countries very rapidly declared their independence and very rapidly said that they didn't want to be part of any Russian-led coalition. This took the Russians a little while to digest, but in the meantime, and also not since yesterday, since the beginning of the 1990s, they have been conducting these limited wars, which generally lead to what we call frozen conflicts. There's one in Georgia, one in Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan, and others. And they are a tool that the Russians have been using for some time to exert control over these smaller neighboring countries of theirs without necessarily violating any major agreements or principles of international law. Now, I was one of the main negotiators of the so-called post-Cold War settlement with the Russians from between 1994 and 1997. And I can tell you that the Russians who we dealt with in those days were people, they came from the Yeltsin club, so to speak. These were people who wanted very much to be a part of the West. These were people who had no trouble with the enlargement of NATO. These were people who wanted to have a democratic system in Russia. The problem is that these very same people didn't get a hold of the economic, legal, and if you want to call it moral aspects of the situation in Russia. And pretty soon, Russia became, economically seemed, a KGB state. This has all been documented by several very good books which have come out recently. And it shows that the club that Vladimir Putin grew up in, by the way, the KGB club, worked very hard to get control of the economy, to get control of foreign economic relations, including with the United States, and to make sure that these countries on the periphery of Russia, that sometimes called the near abroad, felt very, very dependent on the new Russia, which emerged from the Soviet Union. This leaves us with the task of what do we do about this? Barack Obama once probably spoke too honestly when he called Russia a declining regional power. Former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of Germany in the 1980s, when Russia was pushing its armaments, called Russia upper volta with rockets. Now that's in a way a insult to Upper Volta. I mean, it has in fact developed quite a bit since then. It's not now called, it's called Burkina Faso now. But in those days, it was Upper Volta, a French designation. And he was very right. Russia was never a country that had anything to offer the West economically, except one thing. I'll come to that in a minute, which is oil and gas and natural resources. But if you look at the difference in development between Russia and China, you see China has moved up from a situation which was much less modernized, much less important than Russia was in, say, 1980, has moved up now to be challenging to be the strongest country on earth. And the Chinese have done this aided by Western and also American investment. But that investment was not a charity. It was done because there was people sensed, smelled, felt very big potential in Russia, in China. And China is now also the first or second world exporting nation, depending on how you look at it. And so Russia is not in the same club with China. This is not the same problem. And I would take issue with any of your speakers who decide that this is a new Cold War. It is not a new Cold War at all. The Cold War was a very special territorial ideological confrontation which grew out of World War II. This is the efforts of countries who do not accept the principles of Western democracy, who are trying to govern themselves according to a, if you will, a totalitarian model, and who are having various successes at it. But the problem for the United States in particular is manyfold. In the first place, if you have been watching what has been going on, you would see that immediately after the 24th of February, everybody was looking to the United States to provide answers and to provide support. And I think that the Biden administration has not done badly in that. Getting the military support organized was difficult, but it's been happening and it's growing. And providing the democratic support by organizing the allies on a single track has been really quite successful. Not 100%. There are countries there which are more active, such as the United Kingdom, major countries which are less active, such as Germany. But nobody has questioned the goals that we share there, and nobody has questioned the reason why it is important for us to support an independent Ukraine. I will close by just mentioning three of these points. First, the Ukraine is in trouble with Russia, not because of military joining NATO, not because it's a threat to Russia. It's in trouble with Russia because it is a different kind of threat. It's a threat to the political culture of the Russian Empire. Ukraine was always the biggest prize of the Russian Empire. And to this day, many, many Russians cannot believe that their country can exist without Ukraine. For the United States and its European allies, it is exactly the opposite. We did not go out hunting for new members of either the EU or Russia, but at least half a dozen of them have raised their hands and said they want to be members of both of them. Why? Because we offer by far the best social, political, technological option for these countries. Becoming part of Russia is to become part of the past, unfortunately. Russia has not met the challenges of the digital age. The second reason that it's important for Americans is simply militarily. We cannot be facing a military challenge from Russia with its 2,000 nuclear warheads without being worried about it. It is very much in our interest to make sure that this Russia understands that it cannot play games with these nuclear weapons, cannot play games with its neighbors based on its ability to show off these nuclear weapons, and that Russia has to become a part of the rules-based international order, which we in fact worked out with them in the 1990s. And finally, also an equally important issue for us is the fact that a complete loss of Ukraine in the 2020s would in fact undermine the European project, would undermine the ability of our European allies to work together, to work with us rather than against us. And it's very much, as we move into the digital age, where time and space freeze into nothing. And I can say in my own example, I started out this series sitting in my home office in Berlin, and now I'm sitting in my home office in Nashville, Tennessee. And how I look and how I talk and what I'm talking about makes no difference where you're sitting. That is an important part of the future. But if Europe then now cannot join this future, it is a major loss for the United States. And if Europe and the United States lose the democratic orientation of Ukraine, it will be a major loss for us as well. So there is a background to what's going on. And I would be very happy to enter into a discussion, Patrick, with you or with other listeners to see how we wish to discuss this issue.
That's terrific. Ambassador, I've got a few questions for you. We'll have a bit of a conversation, then we'll invite our audience to contribute their questions as well. Let's pull the string a little bit more on, is this the new normal? We've seen not quite an alignment, but certainly a distancing of some non-Western nations. You know, there was the BRICS meeting, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa met, and they put some distance between the Western response to Ukraine. And there are other countries in the lesser developed country portfolio who have been lukewarm to supporting what the United States and Europe is doing in Ukraine. And this is really the first major war, the first flagrant attempt in Europe since World War II to conquer a sovereign neighbor. Let's talk a little bit about what this means for the health of the international system in Europe and the wider global audience.
Very good question. Let's start with the basic point. International law is not law. It is not law in the sense of the US Code of Regulations. It's not law in the sense of any legal code in Western Europe. International law is built on precedents, behavior, and consensus. And that has been one of the major achievements of the United States, going back actually to the administration of Theodore Roosevelt, who pushed very hard for the establishment of the Hague Court and the principles which are the basis of the World Court. What Russia has done, and China to a little bit, but mostly Russia, has simply said none of these things apply to us. We are taking back Ukraine, and the ostensible reason changes every 5 days or so, but at the moment it's because there is a community of Russian speakers there who need protection. That's not true. There are large communities of Russian speakers there, and they are among the strongest supporters of Ukrainian independence. But the international law is, in other words, something that is defined by the stronger and the more influential countries who define it. Sometimes the United States has been on the wrong side, by the way, of international law. I'll say that very openly. I worked on some things when I was in the State Department, which we were clearly simply ignoring international law. But in general, we have been the champion of international law, and as have the Western Europeans. And for this to be lost now by a Russia which feels that it can simply attack a neighboring country because they used to have an arrangement between themselves is simply unacceptable. The second reason is that world economy, not the kind of trade that we think about when we think about trade agreements, but the even more deeply running world economy, which is based on global digital networks, global structures which have nothing to do with anything of the relations between the big countries and the small countries. This is going to be the future. And I have been, for some time, been arguing a point which I first came upon in 2004, when the American National Intelligence Estimate came out, 2004, 18 years ago, and said that the digital revolution is going to be a major upheaval which will touch every corner of modern society. This is why this Russian behavior is so bad, not only because it's seeking to destroy another country, which seems to be the basis of Russian military tactics, but also because it is disrupting the building of this new world order, which is something which at the moment the West dominates, but is something that has caused some doubts in certain parts of the world. The most important, I would say, being India, but also important being Brazil. You can see two very large countries there. And the country which is the largest Muslim state on earth. It surprises some people to hear this. The largest Muslim state on earth is not India, it's not Pakistan, not Saudi Arabia, but Indonesia. And it is a very, very productive and a very, very rapidly moving country. It was very interesting to read just a few days ago that India has disinvited Vladimir Putin from the so-called G20 summit. There is the G7, which are the industrial nations, and the G20, which is the rest of the world. And they have ostentatiously disinvited Putin from the summit, which is supposed to take place later in the summer. That's a very big step forward. And that's the kind of step which is necessary if we are going to be able to function as a globally integrated world.
Let me turn to the question of invasion fatigue. I think conventional wisdom is Americans are very adept at jumping from one headline to another, and we've seemed to have moved on from the Ukrainian question. President Biden is committed to the cause and has stepped up with aid and munitions. But what of the Europeans and the Americans' inability to stay focused? And if this truly is a long slog of a war, what about American leadership post 2024? If there's a change of party in the White House? And let me just add a cherry on there. We've seen Boris Johnson announce his resignation today, and how might that impact some of the Western resolve?
Well, this is an important point. War fatigue, investment of political capital fatigue is something which harms or influences, I won't call it harms, which influences democracies more than aristocracies. Putin watches out for his domestic political back, but the fact is that he doesn't really have any worry about it. In China, they also seem to be able to motivate or to mobilize people in a direction they want them to, such as the recent COVID quarantines that they've set up. But the fact is that the Western societies can only take so much burden, so much presentational burden. And we already have, needless to say, we have COVID to worry about. We now have inflation to worry about. We now have political conflict to worry about. And sadly, in our own country, we also have gun usage to worry about. It's going to be very hard to maintain this high level of discipline among the Western countries. Putin knows this. If you see the way he responds to various initiatives by Western countries, you will see that he responds to them basically with sarcasm. He and his people around him believe that they can hold on, they can sit this one out until the West loses interest, and then they will be able to incorporate either parts of Ukraine, or maybe even they're still dreaming of all of Ukraine, into their sphere of influence, or maybe back into the Russian Republic. This is going to be a very major global confrontation, which is going to go on for some time. But as I said, I refrain from calling it a new Cold War, because the Cold War had very specific foundations. It was the end of a big shooting war. It was the prize was Germany, which has now been settled. Germany has gone to the West, and so have the other Eastern European countries, which were in the Warsaw Pact at that time. And it was also very ideological. That is, the ideology was that there is something called communism or socialism, which was going to organize the world better than what they called capitalism in the West. Right now, Russia is probably the most capitalist country on the world. There is no big ideological problem between Russia and the United States or Europe. The problem is really something much more fundamental, and that is the self-image, the internal values of the Russian Federation. And we have seen that these internal values are focused primarily on Russia being a large empire. And the reason that Ukraine is such a problem for them is not only that they want to keep all of these countries under their control, but because it's the largest, most independent, and has in the past 5 years been also the most successful of the former Soviet republics. That is something which Russia cannot stomach, be it Putin or somebody else who succeeds him. And that is something which is very important, as I've just said, for the West. So I think that we'll have a very big battle going on now, perhaps not necessarily a shooting war, but a battle for influence and inspiration, which probably goes on for the next 10 or 20 years. I'm sorry to say that, but I think that's probably going to be the case.
Can you talk a little bit about, under the question Western resolve, what comes to mind when you consider France, Germany, and the UK domestic circumstances and their ability to keep their eye on the prize?
Well, I'll go answer the last part first. I have been arguing for quite some time, and in a time when I was also doing this actively, that without the organizing ability and the strength and the power of the United States, there would be no unified Europe. And I believe that still to this day. So it's very, and if there were no unified Europe, that would be for the United States, contrary to what former President Trump may have believed, that would be a disaster. And the whole question of how much the Europeans contribute to the common defense is important. I was at NATO, which is now almost 35 years ago. Our number was not 2%, it was 3%, which should be the European contribution to defense. But from an American point of view, we simply have to accept the fact that the Europeans are not up to doing this, and that if the balance and order in this part of the world, which has 500 million inhabitants, by the way, has a larger GNP than the United States, has larger foreign trade than the United States, and is the country of for 95% of us, the country of our origin. And so to lose the support and control from these countries would be a major loss for each other and for them also. But our investment in keeping them together and prosperous is nothing compared to what we have earned from them over the past 40 years in foreign investment, in trade, in support for international positions. It's like 1/10 of what we have earned from being the strongest power in Europe. So that's the basic point for us. The second one is, of course, that the new normal is going to be a collapsing Russian empire. It's going downhill still. Nothing Putin does about it is going to change the very steady and rapid decline of Russia. In fact, there are some estimates which say that they have already lost, since the 24th of February, they've already lost 200,000 well-trained, successful younger people, because these younger people simply see no future left in Russia. So Russia is going to be a problem for us, and we shouldn't think that this is a short-term thing that we're just going to turn off. We do have to, in fact, think more in terms of the Cold War as a longer-term engagement to keep Russia from upsetting the developed world as we see it. And I have used, in other comments that I've made, I've used the example of Berlin, which I know very well. I've lived in that city almost 30 years myself. And I was in charge of the American occupation in the 1980s there. And the reason that Free Berlin survived was not because of our military forces, as good as they were. It was because we were able to keep up the morale of the people in the city with the American commitment to their ultimate unification and freedom. And so that's going to be the job of American leadership in the next 10 or so years, is going to be to keep up the morale of the democratic world. And that democratic world is now very large, but it's not forever. And if we don't keep up the morale of the democratic world, we will find that we are the losers.
Well, we've got some terrific questions in the queue, but let me end my portion of the conversation here with a combination of questions. Stephen Shore asks, is a Ukrainian victory possible or desirable? Ambassador Charles Bowers has a question: how and when does this war end? And my question would be, what do you see in the coming months on the political military front in terms of resolving the conflict, or seeing it stabilize in some way where we're at least looking at a ceasefire or some onset of negotiations? Or what are the prospects?
Well, if you look simply at the hard, cold facts, it doesn't appear to me that Ukraine could win totally. The real question is, what do we define as victory? Russia has been in Crimea since 2014. There's no war in Crimea right now, and I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to be able to dislodge them from Crimea. The two eastern provinces are a different matter, but we shouldn't forget there's been a war going on, and you should use the word war, in Donetsk and Luhansk since 2014 also. The Ukrainians decided they must challenge that occupation, and they have been doing so. The Russians now, after they first started to believe they could take over the whole country, now seem to have reduced their goals down to these two provinces and a little bit of spit of land, which gives them an opening to the Black Sea. The Russian behavior ,30% of the wheat consumed in the world. 30%. That's an awful large number. At the same time, the Russian oil supplies, which the West has now really turned off to a considerable extent and is still doing it, have kept much of the world not only warm, but also prosperous. It's been the cheap energy out of Russia, which, for example, fueled the major German export boom over the past 10 years. So these are very important, you want to call them collateral differences, collateral effects of this war, but they are just as important as the shooting. The fuel crisis has also reached a point where Europeans are now talking about keeping their thermostats below 65 in the winter. The food crisis has reached a point where countries who can hardly afford it, West Africa, Central Africa, are wondering now where they're going to get the food for the next 6 months ahead. So the Russians, as someone more influential than I said recently, the Russians can't build anything, but they certainly can destroy things. And I think we're going to be in a situation now where the Russians are following their strategy of destruction, as they have done in Ukrainian cities, as they did in Syrian cities a couple of years ago, and that this fact in itself is going to be a major problem for the West.
We have a couple of questions that kind of tie together. Russell Goodman asks, do you see any honorable men or women in Russian power circles that the West can negotiate with? A question about Putin. Nick McCall asked, should he leave office immediately? Admittedly, not at all likely in the present times. What are your thoughts as to what the West might anticipate as to his successors? And another question from an anonymous attendee who asks, is there anybody in the Russian government and circles there who might step up to oppose Putin?
Well, let's start with the last part first. Putin took over partially because he was shall we say, the chairman of the board of the KGB structures, which started taking over Russian industry, Russian financial business, and also foreign trade by Russia, started taking it over even when the Soviet Union was still there. And so the system now that governs Russia is essentially an extension of the old KGB, which is now called the FSB. You can see it in some of their behavior. The assassinations overseas, for example, are a very good example of what they do. And I don't think that there's anybody in the current leadership group that would challenge Putin or would be any better if he challenged and won. And I read this fairly carefully, and I don't think that there is any chance of that happening. The real problem is going to be, and we're hoping maybe against hope, that the sanctions which the West has applied to Russia, which are very, very far-reaching sanctions, will sooner or later start to bite. It's really only been 2 months since they were put in place. And as you know, in economic processes, 2 months is like 2 seconds in world history. So we don't know what's going to happen. But you notice that Putin does seem to care a little bit about public opinion. their police state methods of rounding up everybody who even carries a small little sign against him is an example of that. They don't want any subgroups to be joined who support Navalny or anyone else. But at the same time, the large majority of Russian population is a population which has been sort of pushed into immobility over the past 60 or 70 years and doesn't really have the sense of political opposition or the sense of changing regime that you would find even in some of the Eastern European countries. So that's point one. I don't think that's going to happen. What does that then mean for the United States and for Europe? It means probably that we treat Russia the way we did in the Cold War, but also understanding that this is not the Cold War which we remember, but to try to isolate them as much as possible, put as much pressure on them as possible. And maybe there is somebody there who would challenge the leadership, which, as I said, comes mostly out of KGB circles. The immigration, which has been very large, 200 or more thousand people have left already, which is nothing compared to, which is much more than the number of people who have left Ukraine, is the younger, technological, Western-oriented group of people who we would hope might form some kind of opposition in Russia. And Putin probably doesn't care if they leave. You notice there has been no efforts to stop people from leaving. He probably doesn't care that they're leaving because they are the ones who might challenge his power and, by the way, his unbelievably large wealth that he has garnered from this job that he has. And so I think that what they're counting on is a Russia which can live by foreign receipts for energy and minerals. It doesn't need to have the sophisticated trade with the world that China has, for example, but which is also made up of people who are basically passive and uncontrollable. I think that's the future that they see for Russia. It's a very dim future. In the end, it will be a very destructive future and probably will lead to other military outbreaks in the future. But at the moment, he can survive on this foundation, and it's probably what he's going to do or try to do.
Ambassador, a couple of questions about the actors on the side of what's transpiring in Europe. And one is India. Hollis Hart asks, and I think India-Russian relations have been stable for some time, military purchases of arms in New Delhi and so forth. But she asks, is there a sea change in terms of India's approach to Russia? And Jackie Shrago asks if there's anything that the United States could do or needs to do to influence India to more appreciate the rules-based set of democratic ideals in dealing with Russia.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. When we talk about India, we can talk about a few other countries also, which are countries which are filled with resentment from the colonial period. India was made up of a dozen or more truly ancient, successful, sophisticated kingdoms. And the fact was, however, that there was little unity among them, and the British were able to take it over fairly easily. The number of British military or civil servants who were in India during the heyday of the colonial period, the Raj, as they called it, was really minuscule. The place was self-governed for most of the time by these hereditary monarchies around the country. And it is exactly the tradition of these monarchies which led from the very beginning what do we call it, an antagonistic view of the West from India. At the same time that everybody was speaking English and playing soccer, the Indians were politically politically to be very independent, and there was a very long period from the mid-60s really to the mid-90s when there was hardly any high-level exchange between the United States and India. We weren't enemies in any means, but India had a very, very restrictive foreign investment law. It was not a country like Western Europe or even Russia, which was flooded by Western investment because the Indians wouldn't allow it. And so they have, in fact, oriented themselves to Russia over the past 60 years, at least, if not more. Not so much because they're in any way pro or anti-Russian, but because they want to be separate from the West. I had a seminar in Berlin now 4 years ago where we went into this question of whether digital diplomacy would be the wave of the future. And there were lots of experts there who said they thought it would be. But then we had a very high level expert from India, and he made clear that India wasn't interested, that India wanted to stay on its own track. So I think that India is probably the most populous country on earth now, more than China. It has a population structure which is much different than China, many, many young people, which China does not have. And it has, of course, also the high-tech industry that China has, not quite as active and as aggressive, but it has it. And if you look at the heads of the internet companies in California, Microsoft, Google, they all have Indian CEOs. And so there is a different kind of relationship with India. The current prime minister is not somebody of America's liking or Europe's liking. He is very authoritarian and very, shall we say, much more oriented towards China and the and Russia than the United States is. But they are going to be a big, big challenge to us, a challenge which we more or less neglected, if we're very honest about it, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's 40 years right there. We neglected India, and now we're going to have to not do it. The other big question mark for us, I'm now speaking for the United States, is Brazil, a country also of 200 and some million people, larger than the continental United States, which simply has somehow not been able to put it together. And its politics is a mess, but also its scientific research and its industry is not where it should be for a country of that background and that size. So Brazil is a country which we tend sometimes to ignore. It's a country we need to take seriously. So when you add all this up, there is in fact a second tier of countries who have populations in the hundreds of millions of people. Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, India, Pakistan, who are not necessarily big believers in the Western way of life. And that is going to be a very important challenge for our Atlantic community, not just the United States, but the Atlantic community over the years to come. And just one other interesting example, most of you have noticed that Boris Johnson in London has finally decided that his party is over and he's got to leave office. Of the 5 candidates to succeed him, the 5 that are, as they say, the great mentioner in the press have mentioned, 3 of them have their origins in the Indian subcontinent. So there is sort of a reverse influence which is going on also, which is happening in our country, it's happening in Western Europe. Germany, most of us think of Germany as a nice place with people that wearing lederhosen and drinking beer or whatever. But they have exactly the same percentage of foreign born that the United States does, 15%. And if you live in a city like Berlin, which I do, you go to areas where German, English, French, nothing is spoken. Turkish is the language of great portions of Berlin, great portions of the city of Cologne, great portions of Stuttgart. All of the major industrial centers in Germany also have very large, in this case, mostly Turkish, but to give Angela Merkel a little bit of her due, she said, we're ready to take in Syrian refugees. They took in well over 1 million. And my wife has several friends who work with refugees in Berlin. And they say, and the newspaper statistics hold that out, that these refugees are becoming tremendously positive contributors to German society. So it's quite, again, I keep saying this, but it's the way it is. It's not quite as simple as it might have seemed, whether you either have immigrants or don't have immigrants. It's a question of how they contribute to the economy. And Western Europe is finding they're contributing to the economy quite substantially.
Let me ask you about China. We have a couple of questions that relate to the perception of what's happening with the Ukraine invasion, the applicability in the Western Pacific. Jim Hollingshad asks, how significant is what's going on with the invasion of Ukraine, setting parameters or expectations within which China addresses its aspirations for Taiwan and the broader Asian issues? And Angela Wack, the executive director of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, touches on the implications for the global economy. We see the grain issue that you mentioned, 30% of the world's grain coming from the breadbasket of Ukraine and Southwest Russian Federation. But in the case of Taiwan, we see major exports of chips. Chips are vital to our digital industries. Can you talk a little bit about what lessons learned that Beijing might be getting from the Moscow playbook on Ukraine and the Western response?
Well, that's very interesting. I was in my early 20s when the Vietnam War started. And I was, of course, a major, strong opponent of the whole thing. Now, 50 years later, when I look at the world, it seems to me that it was a sacrifice that we made, probably an unknowing sacrifice, by the way. I'm not saying this was anybody's strategy, but the sacrifice we made in Ukraine, in Vietnam, I mean, was one of the reasons that the Russians hesitated to be too aggressive as their country started to go downhill. And the question is, your question is, will the Chinese draw the same lesson for Taiwan? I think they probably will. I think they have probably forgotten. And let's not forget, of all the countries we have been mentioning in this 45 minutes or so that we've been talking, there is only one of them in which the United States fought a direct war with soldiers on the ground. And that's China in Korea after 1951, after MacArthur left. And so we did have a major war with China, which went on for over 2 years until President Eisenhower, as one of his first steps in office, ended the war with a truce. And it's highly likely that this may be the same thing this time. We'll end the war with a truce. The truce was so unsatisfactory that it still holds in Korea now, 59 years ago. We had the same thing. I was also one of the negotiators of the Dayton Agreement. The Dayton Agreement was also a truce. We weren't able to move forward to a truly unified approach in the region after the Dayton Agreement. It's now been in force for 26 years. And it shows no signs of fading. So living with an unacceptable is the best you can do. And I am suggesting good examples, but they're accurate examples. What sometimes happens.
Ambassador, your audio is fading in and out a little bit. We'll hang with you here a second. Okay, it looks like we've temporarily lost Ambassador Kornblum. I hope up to this point everyone has enjoyed the presentation. Let me turn to a couple of questions here and see what we can make of some of this. I think Thomas Kovac has a terrific question. What more can the U.S. and NATO do to offer military support to Ukraine? There was kind of a lull in the level of support in terms of sophistication in weapons provided. We were providing a lot of munitions for closer tactical engagement. And then about 2 months ago, the United States decided that we would release the missile launch rocket system and the HIMARS long-range systems to Ukraine, and they've made tremendous effect of those weapons in the eastern province against the attack in the Donbass. But the numbers of those systems are probably low, and there's still talk about air support and the use of former Soviet aircraft from Eastern Europe. Some of that has come through, but the West is reluctant to provide frontline Western fighters. I think that's still a conversation to be had. In terms of what the United States and the West has done, has been really a significant effort in mobilizing the logistics potential of NATO nations to provide military support. And we can also look at the humanitarian aid that's been provided. As I mentioned, the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg had a terrific conversation about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and that's available for you to catch. We see Ambassador Kornblum coming back in.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it seemed to be my fault.
No worries. The question that I was fielding from Thomas Kovac was, what more can the U.S. and NATO do to support Ukraine militarily?
Well, I'm certainly no expert on this, but it seems to me that the United States is doing much and doing what it can. The situation in Europe is different. The British have been very, very active, but the French and the Germans have been very, very reticent in what they've been doing. And it was interesting, after the three heads of government of the three most important European countries went to Kiev on the 16th, I think it was, of June, two of them, the German and the French, left the meeting saying how they were going to go and call Putin and try and influence him. That's not the way that this is going to happen. I, in fact, have an article in the works, which is going to appear in the German press next week, which says that a so-called diplomatic solution is not going to work here. It's not going to happen either on the battlefield or in the sanctions arena, if we can call it that. And I think so. Are we doing everything we can? I guess we are, but I have friends in Washington who I talk to almost every day on this issue, and even they are not sure whether we're doing everything we can be doing. So it's a very difficult issue. In Germany, which has neglected its military for the past 20 years, they have come to the conclusion that they have nothing more to give. That's a little bit questionable, but you know, that's, again, you're dealing with sovereign countries. You can't tell them what to do.
We have a question, a couple of questions about diplomacy. Mary Schaefer-Conroy asks about the Budapest Memorandum, whether it has any significance. And that's, I guess, a 21-year-old agreement now that provides for the sovereignty of Ukraine, signed by Moscow. And obviously they
forgot about that.
They forgot about that. And what do you see as diplomacy having any traction in what's happening, or is it on the shelf while they slug it out?
Well, I will send you when it appears, so that I have to wait till then, so I know what the final text is. An article that I wrote with a friend in Berlin trying to argue that there is no diplomatic option at the moment, and giving examples of past diplomatic successes, which were always reviewed by major Western military engagement. That's true for the fall of the Soviet Union. It's true for Bosnia. It's true for the Chinese situation. And so I don't think that there is, given the circumstances right now, with the Russians hanging on, and it's really just hanging on, they're not making any great advances, but they're hanging on, and they are not willing to give up. The only thing that I could see, and this would be very controversial, nobody in the United States government would support it, but the only chance we have of changing that situation in a great way is to start hitting targets inside of Russia. And as I said, this is a very unpopular thing. Nobody will do it, I don't think. As for the Budapest Memorandum, one of my former colleagues called me up the other day and gave me chapter and verse of how I had ordered her to write that memorandum. So I bear some responsibility for it. I was in Budapest that day when the memorandum was published. The goal here, which was very much pushed by the United States, was to get Ukraine to understand that they didn't really want to be a nuclear power. They had about 30% of the Soviet nuclear weaponry on their territory. They never actually took control of it. There were Russian officers in there all the time, but they had the sovereign decision over it. And the big question was, if it ever came to shooting these rockets off, would they go to Kiev to get permission, or would they go to Moscow to get permission? And everyone, including Ukrainians, by the way, thought that this was a bad situation. And so it was better to stick the Russians. At that time, we thought they were our cooperative partners, to stick the Russians with the responsibility of dealing with these things. The other aspect of it is that after this memorandum was signed, the United States spent something like $500 million. I think it was around that number, small change, in securing Russian nuclear sites. The security of these sites had been very haphazard. And we went in there, this was in 1997, 98. We went in there and simply rebuilt the security for these sites. So the fact is that the system that Putin now is threatening us with was essentially built by the United States. And there were two senators, Senator Lugar and Senator Sam Nunn, who were the sponsors of this, who got the money passed through Congress. And they were considered in those days to have been the great heroes of the ending of the Cold War. Nunn-Lugar is a term that old folks like me still use as a foundation for what our approach to Russia was in those years. And so I really don't think that there's much we can do militarily other than taking the battle into Russia. And a little bit of that has happened, mostly by sort of guerrilla type groups who have come in and blown up oil depots and things like that. But each time the United States and the Europeans have said, no, this is not the way we want to do this. Our diplomacy remains focused on trying to get the Russians to see the light. I personally think that that's overdoing it, that the Russians have decided what they want to do, or Putin and his crowd have decided what they want to do. And there's no amount of American persuasion which can change that. There's probably no amount of American armaments which can change that either. So that means that sooner or later we are going to be left with a, as they call it, frozen conflict. A certain percentage of Ukraine occupied, as it has been for the last 14 years, by Russia, and a very unsatisfactory situation with Russia, which for Russia is actually almost committing suicide, because they're going to be cut off from the West, from the rest of the modern digital world. They're going to be cut off from COVID vaccinations. You notice that their early vaccination, which they said made them independent from the West, has not worked, and nobody's buying it anymore. So they're going to become a very isolated country, and in that sense, a dangerous country. Now, you asked a question about China. A very good friend of mine, who is a very senior China expert, told me last week that we actually had to do with two failed states, Russia and China. The debate about whether China is in fact a burgeoning big power or a stagnating development, LDC, less developed country, is still going on. And there's nothing that any of us can do about it, but it's important to realize that China is not the 5,000-pound gorilla that some people think it is. It's a country with very, very deep problems, which understands the importance of science and technology and is making really important contributions to science and technology, but is really pretty bumbling as far as diplomacy is concerned. This idea that they were going to build this roadway from China to Germany, basically, and get around the United States as a back door is more or less failed. And partially it's failed, not because it's a good idea. I thought it was a very good idea from the very beginning, but because they don't know how to do it. So
John, let me ask you one more specifically about Ukraine. We have we're about out of time here, but we have a couple of questions that Joyce Davis asks about a global force that might have the power to resist the sorts of aggressions that we've seen in Ukraine. And we have a couple of questions about commitment of NATO in Ukraine. Stephen
Oh, yeah.
Geiger asks, at what point would NATO be involved? And we had another question about boots on the ground. And there had been talk about a NATO enforced no-fly zone in the West and those kinds of things. What do you see as, if at all likely, NATO's participation?
Well, NATO, of course, is participating in many ways, and some of them not known.
Well, boots on the ground.
Yeah, but boots on the ground, it is almost a matter of deep belief that the West, that is NATO in this case, does not want to have boots on the ground or does not want to have missiles in the air. You could say it would be an easier way of doing it, because that might trigger the Soviet nuclear response. In many ways, what Putin is doing is holding us hostage through his nuclear weapons. At the same time, Ukraine is extremely important, but it's not the only country which is threatened. Moldova is very threatened. The Baltic states are threatened. And now we have the application for joining NATO of Finland and Sweden, two of the most dedicated neutral countries in the world, have decided that their security situation doesn't allow them to be neutral anymore. So what does that mean for us? That means that the perimeter where NATO directly faces Russia has been extended by 3,000 kilometers in the Finnish border right now. But even more importantly is about maybe 1,000 kilometers of the borders of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And you notice that there was some back and forth with Lithuania about whether Russian transit was allowed into what is called Kaliningrad, the rest of Eastern Prussia, which Russia has still kept for itself. That could be a spark which set off a bigger conflict also. So we're definitely not out of the woods here yet, but the idea of taking the war to Russia is probably the one thing that just about everybody in the world would agree about. No, we can't do it.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up with your final observations. Is this the new normal?
Well, it is the new normal in the sense that the world that we thought, and I thought, we were building in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, a world which would be based on agreed principles of behavior, agreed law-based behavior, has disappeared. There's no question about that. It's not just Russia, but also China and probably other countries. I won't go into any that I don't really understand, but I think there might be other countries who are in the same state of mind. So that has more or less disappeared. That doesn't mean that the West shouldn't maintain those principles and expect Russia to follow them, Russia and China, but it means that at the moment they are in no mood to do so. And we probably are going to be dealing with a phenomenon which happens often in history. Declining empires tend to be very dangerous. And what we're seeing in Moscow right now is not only, it's part of it, not some Putin-esque effort to grab more power. It is really the fears of many people in the elites, plus many simple normal Russians, that their reason for existence is disappearing. The real question is, can Russia, the Russian Federation, continue to exist when it cannot, shall we say, exercise its imperial goals in its neighboring countries and far from its borders? That's the way modern Russia was built. It was not built on the basis of a state in the middle of Russia somewhere. It was built on an expansionary state. Can Russia live with that now? I don't know. We'll wait and see.
Well, we will continue this conversation throughout the summer. Let me close with a thank you again to the American Council on Germany and Dr. Steve Sokol for support of this and the rest of the series. We look forward to their continued partnership with the Tennessee World Affairs Council. We also thank the World Affairs Councils of Harrisburg, the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and the World Affairs Council of the Peoria area. And thanks, as always, to the World Affairs Councils of America for sharing this information with the network of 90 plus World Affairs Councils around the country. We're also appreciative of Belmont University, Center for International Business, the National Area Chamber of Commerce, and the University of Tennessee Center for Global Engagement. Thank you, Ambassador, once again for being with us today. We look forward to you being back in August for the final of 4, maybe 5 sessions in this series. And we look forward to seeing everybody back with us for the rest of the series. Check tnwac.org for the program listings and also your opportunity to become a member or make a donation to what we do as a public service. Ambassador John Kornblum, thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Everybody have a great day. Be well.